I've been reviewing video games on YouTube for quite a long time now, and I've reviewed nearly every single game in the Call of Duty series apart from some of the handheld spin-offs. This is a series that I've been more or less a fan of over the past almost 20 years now, given that the original came out in 2003 and I did play it back then. I mean, hell, the original Call of Duty and its expansion pack United Offensive remain my gold standard for World War II first-person shooters to this day. And while a lot of people really like to hate on Call of Duty just for the fact that it's Call of Duty, the simple reality is that the series is still popular for a reason. It has a very strong core gameplay loop that is very easy to pick up and play, and very easy to enjoy. And even in most of the Call of Duty games that aren't very good, it's still got that solid core gameplay loop, so you can still get something out of it if you're a fan of the franchise. And really the only exception to that I can think of is Call of Duty World at War Final Fronts, and if you're curious about that, go check out my review and you'll understand why in pretty short order. And by now you're probably wondering, well DW, why are you talking about all of this? Why are you bringing all of this up before you've even introduced the game itself in this particular review? Well, I'm saying all of that because Call of Duty Vanguard is still being played by quite a few people and has been enjoyed by quite a few people. And I'm pretty sure that that core gameplay loop is the only reason why. Because that was quite literally the only thing other than simply the drive to make a video on Call of Duty Vanguard that was keeping me playing Call of Duty Vanguard long enough to be able to review it. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what that means. So let's go ahead and get this video review started. This is Call of Duty Vanguard for PC, Xbox One, Xbox Series S and X, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5. And what you're seeing here is the PC version. Also, fair warning, you'll notice a bunch of stuttering in the gameplay footage. That's not actually the game's fault, that is the fault of my recording process, where there was some issue with the bit rates or something, which hopefully I'll have sorted out by the time I move over to a new PC. Call of Duty Vanguard is a first-person shooter and the latest entry in the Call of Duty franchise as I'm recording this video, although Modern Warfare 2 2022 is right around the corner. The main development studio for it was Sledgehammer Games, the same developers of Call of Duty World War II, but they had assistance from most of the other studios under Activision's banner, including Treyarch, funnily enough, even though they had just finished Black Ops Cold War the previous year. Although I use the term finished loosely with regards to the original launch version, but that's beside the point. And when Vanguard released last year, it was to a very mixed reception at absolute best. Clearly, some people were enjoying the game, but there was also a lot of criticism being leveled at the game for things like a lack of innovation, which isn't exactly an uncommon criticism with this series, but that's beside the point, as well as issues with the campaign, issues with the multiplayer, and the Zombies mode launching with only one map, and that map just being cobbled together haphazardly from a bunch of existing assets, and the content in the Zombies mode being absolutely awful. Now, to be fair, I'm probably not the best person to look at the Zombies mode and try to compare it with previous entries and determine whether or not it's any good, because, frankly, I find zombies in general ridiculously boring, and I find the Zombies modes in Call of Duty ridiculously boring. But even then, I can see just how bad the Zombies mode was in this game at launch, where it was so bare bones and so haphazardly slapped together that it actually made the original iteration of the Zombies mode back in Call of Duty World at War in 2008 look way better than it. Thing is, it's been close to a year since Call of Duty Vanguard launched, so they've had plenty of time to patch things up with regards to glitches and crashing and things like that. They've had plenty of time to patch in new content for both the multiplayer and for the Zombies mode. So while you may think the main question would be something like, well, did they patch up all of those issues and make this the game it really should have been on launch? The actual question that needs to be asked with Call of Duty Vanguard is, what in the unholy fuck have they done to this thing? So, let's just start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we're going to go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on the same engine that powered Modern Warfare 2019, although there have been a few tweaks here and there. And in most places where it matters, they've done a very good job with the visuals, from modeling and texture quality being quite high, to the animations being pretty smooth and fluid, although with regards to the weapon handling, they are woefully anachronistic. you see a lot of very modern weapon handling techniques with regards to mag retention reloads and things like that, which have really only been a commonplace thing since the 2000s. You might have seen some early instances of it in, say, the 80s and 90s, but they definitely weren't a thing in the 40s. I mean, hell, even the idea of wielding pistols with both hands, where the offhand is your support hand, is really a very modern thing that's only really been a thing since the 80s and 90s. And the sad part is, even if you were willing to suspend disbelief with regards to how modern those weapon handling animations are, in some cases they actually end up looking downright ridiculous, like the mag retention reloads on the Thompson submachine gun when it has drum mags on it. Those things are big and hard to handle and very heavy. There's no way you're doing a mag retention reload with one hand holding two of those drums. But if it were just the weapon handling animations that were anachronistic and often ridiculous, that would be tolerable if somewhat annoying. But they have gone way off the deep end with regards to the ludicrous attachments that you can put on the various weapons, ranging from wildly anachronistic optical sights that actually kind of look out of place even on weapons today, let alone stuff from the 40s where they just would not have been a thing, like really low profile, really thin red dot sight kind of stuff, which have really only been feasible in the last, say, 5 or 10 years, certainly not in the 40s, or the thermal optics or night vision optics, which are clearer than the stuff we actually have now, which is probably for gameplay reasons, but even back in the 40s, those were cutting-edge prototypes that were absolutely gigantic, completely impractical for any actual use, and required you to have a backpack battery just to power the damn things. And about all you would see through those optics is just a big blur of light. And even if you ignore the ridiculous holographic sights and red dot sights and thermal and night vision optics and things like that, they even throw utterly ridiculous things in there like screwing a proper rifle scope to the slide, not the frame, the slide of a 1911, which would probably slow the action down enough to where you would no longer have a semi-automatic pistol, you would have a manually operated pistol, much like a bolt-action rifle, only it's a pistol, so it's completely useless, and you would also have a scope that would probably be throwing off its zero constantly, thus resulting in being completely useless, and that's assuming that the scope even stays mounted to the pistol in the first place. I mean, you can suspend disbelief on things like maybe putting some sort of muzzle brake or something on a rifle barrel where it normally wouldn't be. Maybe an armorer could do something like that. Maybe an armorer could take the scope off of, say, a Kar 98 and find some way of mounting it onto, I don't know, a Springfield or a Mosin Nagant or something like that. And even doing something like replacing the iron sights on a rifle with iron sights that are easier to read wouldn't be that weird. I mean, even doing things like replacing the internal magazine of a bolt-action rifle with some sort of detachable magazine, while sometimes straining what is possible, is not that weird. Those kinds of things have been done, and some rifles actually did have detachable magazines. I mean, look at, say, the SMLE, the Lee Enfield if you're not familiar with it, which had 10-round detachable box magazines, although they were only issued with one magazine, so you would just feed it with stripper clips instead. Those kinds of modifications aren't that bad. And even doing things like bolting some sort of vertical foregrip on a rifle were actually done in the field sometimes. So it's not like every single attachment or modification to the weapons in Call of Duty Vanguard is completely out of the realm of possibility. But a lot of them are wildly anachronistic to the point of being completely impossible for this time period, and a lot of them are also absolutely hideous and, in many cases, would make the guns outright non-functional. Got a gun whose recoil spring goes into the stock and thus removing said stock would turn it into a non-functional firearm? Who cares? Lop that stock off anyway, it'll work just fine in Vanguard. Drum magazines were ludicrously unreliable back then, so barely anybody made any use of them, but of course you can just slap them on damn near anything in this game. Even the M1 Garand, which loads from an 8-round N-block clip and not some sort of detachable box magazine, which is clearly why the M1 still makes the ping sound when you run out of ammunition in the drum magazine, even though there's nothing to make the ping sound because that's what the N-block clip does! I mean, even on the stuff you can't put any attachments on, they still manage to screw up the functionality. Like the Panzerfaust, for example, which is a one-shot, disposable launcher. You pulled it out, you shot it at whatever armored vehicle you were shooting it at, and you could not reload it. There was no way of doing so, which is clearly why in Vanguard you just pull out another warhead out of nowhere and just stick it on the tube and keep going. It is just painfully obvious at every turn that not only do Sledgehammer games have absolutely no idea how any of these things work, they just don't care. And nowhere is that more painfully obvious than in the various rechamberings that you can do on many of the weapons. You can rechamber submachine guns, which use pistol rounds, to 8x33 Kurz, which is an intermediate rifle round. It is considerably longer and more powerful than a pistol round, but apparently you can do that. You can rechamber a BAR, which is normally in 30-06, a pretty powerful round I might add, to 50 BMG! 50 caliber Browning machine gun. That is an anti-material round. And when you rechamber the BAR for it, not only does it not just massively upscale in size, because there is no way in hell you're fitting a 50 BMG into a BAR, it's just way too big and way too powerful, it would blow the damn thing up in your hands. But they don't even adjust the magazine size or anything like that, it's just, nope, we're just gonna give you more power and it's a slower rate of fire, yay! The sad part is they only did this because they felt they had to bring the gunsmith mechanic over into Vanguard and they needed a crap ton of attachments to try to keep up with modern warfare, which is just something that wasn't a thing for weapons from the 1940s. That kind of modularity is only something that has come about in the last, say, 20-30 years or so. Even in Black Ops Cold War, it's pretty anachronistic, but at least you can make the excuse of, well, that's set in the 80s, and these guys would have access to the absolute bleeding edge of technology. But even at their most ridiculous, the attachments in Black Ops Cold War are still pretty reserved. They're not stuff that is wildly out of the realm of possibility. Certainly not like what you see in Vanguard. I mean, hell, even the attachments you could put on the Kar 98 in Modern Warfare 2019 weren't anywhere near as egregious as the kind of stuff you can do to the Kar 98 in this game. I mean, the developers went out of their way to model and animate a lot of weapons that we really don't see in other World War II games. A lot of weird prototype weapons, a lot of home guard weapons, and some of that stuff is really well modeled and really well detailed, and then they just go and chop it up like a Bubba going crazy. It's just migraine-inducing. But anyway, I've ranted about that long enough for now. I'll bring it back up when I get to gameplay for reasons that you'll understand then. But suffice to say, even though the actual visual quality is pretty good, they've made some pretty egregious errors in historical accuracy, and they clearly just don't give a crap about it. On the positive side, the game does generally run pretty decently. I mean, it runs about as well as Black Ops Cold War does, but with some more frame rate drops than what you see in Black Ops Cold War. Meaning that you're getting a roughly 60 to 90 FPS at 1080p on an i7-4790K 16 gigs of RAM and a GTX 1080. And that's of course with everything maxed out. It does occasionally dip down into the 50s, and it does do that more than Black Ops Cold War did, but it's never long enough and severe enough of a drop that it really affects the gameplay. What does affect the gameplay in terms of performance, however, is that, at least in the single-player mode, it's really not all that stable. It crashed on me several times as I was playing through the campaign, and I really wasn't sure why, because I couldn't really replicate any of the crashes either. It's not something I ran into when playing the multiplayer, but I did feel like it was worth mentioning, especially considering that a lot of people had a lot of crashing problems with Black Ops Cold War, but I had no issues with that whatsoever. So obviously your mileage is going to vary on that. Moving on from the visuals, the sound design at least is mostly pretty solid. They've got a pretty decent soundtrack that is not just typical World War II movie music fare, and that actually works out pretty well for the game in the long run, and the voice acting, as we expect from the Call of Duty series at this point, is also quite well done. Unfortunately, a fair few of the lines are pretty cringy, and a fair few of them are just downright terrible, but that's more of a problem with the writing than the voice acting. They did what they could with what they had. And then of course there are the sound effects, which for the most part are pretty decent. The gun and explosion sounds could definitely use more oomph, but they could definitely be a hell of a lot worse. And when you bring all of the presentation together, apart from the egregious errors that they've made, for the most part, it actually ends up working out okay. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and much like with my Black Ops Cold War review, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about the Zombies mode because I have the least to say about it. As I mentioned before, I have absolutely no interest whatsoever in the Zombies mode. I find zombies to be ludicrously boring, and the Call of Duty game's Zombies mode is no exception. That said, I do have to call out Vanguard on its garbage, because it launched with exactly one map, and that was Der Anfang, which was a cobbled-together mess of several different multiplayer maps. It wasn't even anything unique or interesting. And all you end up doing is going between these sections of maps using portals, and then fighting a bunch of zombies and completing the same 2 or 3 objectives over and over again until eventually you can exfil. It is extremely boring, and frankly I can see exactly why people hated the Zombies mode so much on launch. Since launch they've added an additional 3 maps, but that's not enough to save this mode from how half-assed the whole thing is. Because let me put it this way, if somebody like me, who doesn't play the Zombies modes for any actual enjoyment and only plays them enough to get some gameplay footage for the video, as well as get an idea of what's on offer so that they can convey to the viewer whether or not it might be something they'd be interested in, is finding your mode half-assed compared to previous entries, you have seriously screwed up. But what about the elements I do actually care about and do actually play a fair amount of, which are the normal versus multiplayer as well as the campaign? Well, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the multiplayer first, which made just about the worst first impression it possibly could when I jumped into the matchmaking queue and was immediately thrown into a patrol match, which is basically like Hardpoint, where a certain spot on the map will activate after a while and the team has to control it in order to gain points. But instead of each hardpoint being a specific spot on the map and just switching over to a different spot, there's just a control zone that is constantly moving throughout the map. And I'll be fair, the mode itself is not bad. I mean, if you like Hardpoint, you'll probably like Patrol as well. But the complete lack of effort with bringing new modes to Call of Duty Vanguard and just throwing this in there, which is a slight modification of an existing mode, should give you an idea of just what you're dealing with in terms of the multiplayer. It is very lazy and very haphazardly slapped together. In fact, that patrol match that I was thrown into was such a chaotic clusterfuck, I could not tell what was going on most of the time. And that was through a combination of the map being extremely small and cramped, and just the sheer amount of kill streaks and random deaths and grenades and all that kind of stuff that was just going off all around me. This is a problem that plagues a lot of the maps in Call of Duty Vanguard, because as it turns out, most of the maps in Call of Duty Vanguard are pretty cramped. That's not necessarily new for Call of Duty games, and it wouldn't necessarily be an issue if you didn't move so quickly in Call of Duty Vanguard. You see, Call of Duty Vanguard makes use of the tactical sprint from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019, which isn't necessarily a problem, except that the maps in Modern Warfare 2019 were generally designed with that kind of movement speed in mind, which means that they increased the size of the maps to help compensate for that movement, and it actually worked out very well for the most part. Vanguard, on the other hand, not only makes use of the tactical sprint, it increases the movement speed overall, and most of the maps are quite a bit smaller than those in Modern Warfare 2019, so you are just zipping around the maps at Mach 20, and when you combine that with the game's very fast time to kill, it ends up being absolutely ridiculous most of the time. And as if that didn't make things chaotic enough, there's also the complete destruction of any kind of weapon balancing by making every single gun have 10 attachment slots, which is twice the number that you had in both Modern Warfare 2019 and in Black Ops Cold War, and is still even more than if you sprung for the gunfighter wildcard in Black Ops Cold War, but at least in Black Ops Cold War you were giving something up for those extra 3 attachments. So now not only is weapon balance completely thrown out the window, but now you're able to turn nearly every single weapon in this game, except for melee weapons and launchers, both of which don't have attachment slots, into horrifying, completely non-functional abominations that even the worst Bubba would look at and go, "What in the hell did you do to that thing?" And as if that weren't all bad enough in adding to the chaos, there's also the content that's been added throughout the various battle passes and operator bundles and such. Much like with Black Ops Cold War, if you want an operator that isn't one of the ones the game launched with, then you have to buy them in a bundle. Although, unlike with Black Ops Cold War, at least you can earn some cosmetics for your various operators by leveling up the operators and getting access to taunts and finishing moves and intros and things like that, as well as a few extra skins, so they at least fixed that compared to Black Ops Cold War, where you got exactly one skin and anything else you had to buy. But that's not much of a consolation prize when you find out that they have completely given up on any sort of consistency or sticking to the actual theme that they set up for this particular game. You see, the theme of the campaign is the very early days of Special Forces, and so you have a Special Forces squad that you're following the exploits of in the campaign. But apart from ridiculous action movie shenanigans, it's all relatively grounded. And like with previous Call of Duty games, they set up the multiplayer so that you're using stuff that you saw in the campaigns, and it all makes sense for that, at least it mostly does. So, what do you think they would add for the cosmetics? Well, obviously new operator skins for the various characters that were in the campaign, as well as new characters that fit in with the theme, and of course add in some additional World War II weaponry, maybe even a few prototypes that were available in World War II. That's all fine if we're dealing with specifically Special Forces stuff, right? That all makes sense, so why not also throw in, I don't know, the T-800 and T-1000 Terminators, or Snoop Dogg, or maybe even throw in something like the EM-1 laser cannon from Advanced Warfare, but just rename it the EX-1 and turn it into an assault rifle instead of a heavy laser weapon. Maybe even throw in all manner of cyberpunk-type skins and things like that. Do you see where I'm going with this? The Special Forces theme lets you get away with things like recruiting members from various resistance organizations and things like that, thus resulting in female characters that you can play as in the multiplayer. You can make arguments for all manner of weapons that you wouldn't normally see in the various other theaters of war, because they just happen to have access to them being Special Forces. But there's no excusing putting laser guns, or the T-800 or T-1000 Terminators, or all manner of cyberpunk-type skins or things like that into a World War II game that is not alternate sci-fi history. I mean, if this were established as some weird time-traveling World War II sci-fi game, then I wouldn't really care, but it's not. It is meant to be a sort of grounded World War II experience, and that's just not what you get. They completely gave up on sticking to the theme because they want to turn this thing into fucking Fortnite. Gotta rake in as much cash as possible, consistency be damned. About the only saving grace of the multiplayer is that core Call of Duty multiplayer experience is still there, buried under all the garbage. And sometimes when you're playing Vanguard, you'll shift the garbage pile a bit, and that core gameplay will shine through, and you'll get those few moments where it actually is kinda fun. But it's just fleeting moments of that, in a sea of chaotic mess, and that just makes the multiplayer in Vanguard downright infuriating, and frankly downright insulting. And if you were hoping that maybe, like Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, the campaign could salvage the experience, you would be sorely mistaken. I guess I'll begin my discussion of the campaign by talking about the general storyline, where the game starts off with you playing as a guy named Novak, and you are part of a squad of soldiers known as Task Force 001, aka Vanguard. The other members of the squad are Wade Jackson, an American hotshot pilot, Lucas Riggs, the Australian demolitions expert, who of course has severe problems with authority and also is kind of crazy. Then there's Polina Petrova, the Russian sniper, whose entire personality is "I shoot Nazis, they die, that is plan." And then there are two other members of the squad who are just fairly standard British soldiers, and those are Richard Webb and the squad leader Arthur Kingsley, whose only other trait, other than simply being the squad leader who is dependable, is that he has dark skin, which the game uses exclusively to point out that, hey guys, did you know the Nazis were racist? Because if not, let's remind you numerous times throughout the story. That'll clearly not get grating at all. Anyway, apart from him and Webb being friends, the rest of the squad doesn't really get along very well, and that may have you wondering how Novak fits into all this. Well, he's the character who dies at the beginning so that the squad has some vague motivation to avenge him. I'm not joking, he has no lines of dialogue at all, he has no relationship with any of the characters, he's just there, and then he dies at the very beginning of the game after being beaten to death with a chair, because clearly we have to show that behind the veneer of refinement and culture that the Nazi general shows off, he's actually a total barbarian. Anyway, if you want to know anything about Novak, well, you're gonna have to read a tie-in comic, because that's the only place where they give him any kind of character or backstory, and as far as I can tell, the only real character he has is that he happens to be Czechoslovakian. Anyway, the game starts off with you fighting your way along with your squad up through a train, and then you eventually reach your destination and fight your way into a submarine pen, where things eventually go awry and the squad is captured. They are brought before General Freisinger, who, of course, talks about how Beethoven is amazing and these people are beneath him. Then he proceeds to throw around some racial slurs at Kingsley and beats Novak to death with a chair, and sends the rest of the squad off to some sort of secret prison, where they are ultimately interrogated by a sniveling bureaucrat-type guy named Richter. The rest of the game consists almost exclusively of going through the backstories of the various squad members, starting with Arthur Kingsley. He's part of a failed paratrooper drop during the lead-up to D-Day, and ends up needing to take out some coastal batteries so that the troops can land and the invasion of Normandy can begin. During this action, Kingsley proved himself as a leader, and also became friends with Richard Webb. After that, the rest of the flashbacks occur during the interrogation sequences, and you end up covering Polina Petrova's exploits during the Battle of Stalingrad, where she became known as Lady Nightingale, and apparently was solely responsible for inspiring the Russians at Stalingrad to kick the Germans out. When we eventually get to Wade's backstory, it basically involves him flying with his co-pilot Mateo Hernandez, as he becomes a big damn hero during the Battle of Midway. And we also get a bit after that, where he and Mateo are shot down in the Solomon Islands and are trying to evade the Japanese, and they eventually get captured but are rescued by the 93rd Infantry Division. And alongside them, you fight your way through the jungles and eventually to an airfield where they help you get back into a plane, and Wade and Mateo take back to the skies. Then eventually it's Lucas Riggs' turn to have his backstory shown off, and it takes place at Tobruk, where he and his fellow Australians are looked down upon by their British leadership, and they are ultimately sent to recover German supplies. After that, it also skips ahead to the Battle of El Alamein, where Riggs and his fellow Australians are fighting alongside the British against the Afrika Korps, and eventually Riggs and a fellow Australian named Des go off to retake a hill and call in air support, thus leading to an Allied victory, although the British are disregarding the Australians once again, so Riggs takes it out on their very annoying commander and gets thrown in the brig for it. All throughout these flashbacks, Richter is interrogating the various squad members about Project Phoenix and what they're doing there and all that sort of thing, all the while being unaware that he's basically being played for a fool by the squad, and they're just manipulating him into an advantageous position so that they can ultimately escape and go after General Freisinger. And eventually they do exactly that, although they're minus another squad mate in the form of Richard Webb, who Richter shoots in the face. Because sure, he's a sniveling bureaucratic type character, but he's still a Nazi, so we still gotta show that he's a total barbarian and will just execute people for no reason. Anyway, they eventually escape, they go after Freisinger, they take him down, and then they find a motherload of information on all kinds of secret Nazi projects that were supposedly going to be part of the Fourth Reich, thus leaving the game open for eventual sequels or follow-ups of some kind, and then we roll credits. Now, you may be saying something like, hey DW, you just spoiled the entire story. Yeah, I did, and I don't care. Because despite pretty decent acting and pretty good cinematography, the writing is just flat-out garbage. I know I was probably an idiot for expecting any kind of nuance or subtlety or anything of the sort in a game developed by a studio called Sledgehammer Games, but it goes further than that. Not only are the characters all entirely one note, not only do they have basically no personality whatsoever, and not only is the story itself a cliche-ridden mess, but they couldn't even pace it very well. I mean, most of the game takes place in flashback. You only get 3 missions that actually take place in present time. 2 of them are at the beginning. Those are the train and then the sub-pen. The third one is at the very end of the game, and that is the only mission where they actually do something interesting. You see, every single other mission leading up to that point was a turbo-linear, standard military shooter kind of thing. The only things they did to try to spice them up were give each of the characters specific abilities. Arthur can direct fire on things, which doesn't really do much of anything. Polina is fairly nimble, meaning that she can climb on things, and she can also crouch under a bunch of stuff that other people are not able to get under and move quite quickly when doing so. Riggs has a bunch of lethal equipment slots that he can swap between instead of just having one type of lethal equipment at any given point. And Wade has a focus ability that has a cooldown, and when you activate it, you can press the aim button to go into a slow-mo and just automatically target enemies, sort of like an aimbot. Unfortunately, none of these abilities really make all that much of a difference on their own, but the thing they do that's interesting at the very last mission of the game is have you swap between the various perspectives of the squad members as they go about the last mission, because different things are going to be handled by different characters, and so, for example, when it comes time to flank and snipe the enemy, it switches over to Polina, whereas when it comes time to go on point, it switches over to Wade, and when it comes time to command, it switches over to Arthur, and so on and so forth. And it does that all in a rather seamless transition between cutscene and gameplay, and they actually did a very good job with that. The problems are that you're still playing Call of Duty Vanguard, so it's still got all of the main issues that Vanguard has, and they only do it at the very end of the game, whereas they could have been doing that throughout the entire game, and it would have been a hell of a lot more interesting. Maybe even give you the ability to manually transition between different characters to perform different tasks. So maybe there's a bunch of enemies dug in, and whatever you're doing as, say, Arthur or Riggs or whatever isn't working, so you need to switch over to Polina to find a good flanking route. That might have been cool, but nope, it's just turbo-linear, standard military shooter fare until the very last mission, in which case it's still all that, except that it actually makes some use of the squad being, well, a squad instead of just a bunch of people who are doing things on their own. And even that really isn't enough to save the final mission either, because you're still dealing with the very dumb enemy AI and very dumb squadmate AI. You're still dealing with the weird stability issues the game has, where if you're going into a loading sequence, sometimes it'll just get stuck there and you have to manually close and reopen the game to keep going. And of course you're dealing with the absolutely insane amount of inaccuracies, like the Einhorn revolving shotgun, which is based on an actual revolving shotgun, which only had about 100 ever made of in real life, but they're just everywhere in this game. Or the fact that you can get things like the STG-44 in 1941, 42, and 43 in multiple theaters. You'll have Germans using Japanese weapons, you'll have Japanese using German weapons, you'll have things like the absolutely absurd weapon modifications that not only look hideous, but are just completely inaccurate. You'll have things like the Volkssturmgewehr being an assault rifle, even though in real life it was just a semi-automatic rifle that happened to use the same magazines as the STG-44. Because in case you didn't know, that's not Volkssturmgewehr, it's Volkssturmgewehr. Volkssturm being the German Home Guard. It's not people's assault rifle, it's Home Guard's rifle. I'm already tired of games getting this wrong, and it's only been a few that have done it. Anyway, you're also dealing with things like the really clunky flying controls during the Battle of Midway section, which is just miserable to play through. You deal with annoying gimmick sections, like the section during Polina's Memories, or whatever, when you have to track down a German officer and kill him with only a knife, and it plays basically like that one section in Modern Warfare 2019 where you were playing as Farah, and you were having to evade and take down that Russian guy. And no, that wasn't fun in Modern Warfare 2019 either. And worst of all, you're dealing with a game that can't pick a tone and stick with it. It's not sure whether it wants to be serious and dramatic or lighthearted and goofy. You get both wildly oscillating between each other, and it just ends up giving you constant tonal whiplash. It is incredibly annoying. And the end result of all of this is that you get a game that is bafflingly more insulting to World War II than Call of Duty World War II was. And the really sad part is, there is something they could have done to mitigate some of these issues, and that is make it a blatantly sci-fi alternate history World War II game. And by that, I mean stuff like Wolfenstein, where you've got giant mechs running around, you've got super soldiers running around, and all manner of weird, wacky shit happening. They could have very easily made this game that, and it would have at least mitigated some of the historical inaccuracy problems and the fact that you get stuff like the T-800 and T-1000 Terminators in the multiplayer, as well as the laser gun in the friggin' multiplayer. And with that having been established, it at least wouldn't have been completely insulting to World War II. But that's not what they did with Vanguard. Instead, they made something that is actually fairly serious for the most part, and is fairly grounded in reality, and certainly real-life battles, but which they clearly did not care about enough to be able to do things properly. And I think that's what ultimately sums up Call of Duty Vanguard the best. They just didn't care. They didn't care whether anything actually made any sense. They didn't care whether the game was actually paced properly, because even the story is just horribly paced because almost all of it is flashbacks. And so you don't really care about what's going on by the time you get to the end of the game. They didn't care about any kind of balance or even the most basic of logic in the multiplayer, so you end up with this weird attempt at trying to implement elements of Fortnite with all of the brand inclusion stuff, as well as just turning the multiplayer into this absolutely chaotic clusterfuck. And they just didn't care about the zombies mode in general, so they barely did anything with it. The end result of all of this is that you end up with basically the second worst game in the entire Call of Duty franchise. And keep in mind, that means the only game in the franchise it's actually better than is World at War Final Fronts, the absolutely atrocious PS2 exclusive version of World at War that I gave a 0.5 out of 5. That is the only bar that Vanguard is able to clear, and the only reason it is able to do that is because that core gameplay is still in there, buried under all of the terribleness. But that's not gonna save it from getting a 1 out of 5. It is still an absolutely terrible game, and it is utterly pathetic that over the span of 2 games, they have managed to completely demolish all of the forward momentum and all of the goodwill that Modern Warfare 2019 managed to bring them. And it is abundantly clear at this point that having Sledgehammer Games work on the Call of Duty franchise was a massive mistake. They are doing nothing at this point except damaging it further, so they need to be taken off of Call of Duty entirely. And Activision needs to chill the fuck out with the yearly release schedule and the monetization bullshit, because that's only damaging the entire series further as well. I guess we'll just have to wait and see whether Infinity Ward still has their shit together when Modern Warfare 2 2022 rolls around. But after the fairly weak but still not bad Black Ops Cold War and this absolutely atrocious Vanguard, I have absolutely no confidence in Modern Warfare 2 2022. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see how the new one turns out. The beta's coming up pretty soon, so I'll be taking a look at that, and we'll go from there. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.